So today we're going to talking about Article 2 of the Constitution, the executive branch. Now the executive branch is the branch that contains the president. The U.S. Constitution very simply states the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. This is probably the most visible part of American government, the president. When you think about the U.S. government, you probably can name your president. If you were to say, well, who's the president of the United States? You could probably say right now it's Barack Obama. You could probably name a few presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. Ask the same question, well, who's your congressman? Who are some famous congressmen? That question is generally harder. So the executive branch and the president is the most visible portion. But you might find it interesting that the legislative branch, Congress, has 10 sections, right? It takes 10 sections to describe its jobs and its functions. The founders gave a lot of thought to that. The executive branch is much simpler. There are only 4 sections describing the jobs and the functions of the president. So what does the president do? What are the roles of the president? Well, he's the head of state. He's a chief executive. He's a head administrator. He's the chief diplomat. He's a legislator, and he's the commander-in-chief of the army. So he has to balance a lot of different roles. So let's look at each of these roles individually, just in brief. So as a head of state, he's the figure or the face of the nation, right? When you think of the United States, you should think, okay, Barack Obama, the president. So he's sort of this image of what the United States represents. Now, a head of state can rule, like President Barack Obama does have power, or it could just be a figurehead, like in England. When you think of the head of state, you think of the monarch, you think of Queen Elizabeth. She has no ruling power, but she's head of state. So in the United States, the president is also a chief diplomat. He's going to set the foreign policy. We can be isolationist. We can get involved with other countries. Who is the United States going to be friendly with? So he does have a very big part in foreign policy. He's a head administrator. He's responsible for so many organizations. It's his job to make sure that all the different agencies know what they're doing and make sure that everything runs smoothly. The president oversees some 2.7 million people. Government spends about $3.8 trillion a year. So he is a legislator. So while the president can't make laws, he can suggest and try and get laws passed. He has to get a congressman or a senator, just like you and me, to introduce what he wants. But of course, he has a lot more sway in getting it looked at and voted on. Think about things like the Affordable Care Act, which has to do with insurance. That was heavily pushed by the president. It even bears his name. We call it Obamacare. The president has to give a State of the Union address, and the State of the Union address is given once a year, and it tells you how the United States is doing, and stuff like that, but it also lays out what the president's agenda is, what he wants to focus on, and that has a huge effect on what laws get passed. He's the commander-in-chief of the army. Only Congress can declare war, but the president is head of the army. It is his role to protect the country. So with all of these jobs that the president has to balance, you get expressed and implied powers just like you do in Congress. Those that are stated in the Constitution, and then those powers that just have sort of evolved with the government out of the need to manage people, out of the need to declare war. All of these powers, those are the implied powers. So we're going to look at that. And I'm going to highlight in red the stated or the express powers. Those are the ones that come directly from the Constitution. So as I go through each of the powers needed to carry out these jobs, the red is going to be copied and pasted from the Constitution, so you can see the stated powers, the expressed powers. So let's look at head of state. Head of state, of course, is just this idea, this image of who's the leader of the country. A lot of this has to do with being a diplomat and dealing with foreign countries. So the Constitution expressly states he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties. So the president can have extreme power when he goes to, let's say, for example, when the president went to Cuba just recently. No president had been to Cuba since the 1920s because Cuba was communist. President Obama is setting an agenda recognizing Cuba and changing our foreign policy and our relationship with that country just by going. Nixon did the same thing when he went to China. He recognized communist China just by getting in a plane and setting his foot on the country. He legitimized it. So America can legitimize countries. They can set the foreign policy. The president sometimes makes agreements with foreign countries. Agreements are kind of like treaties, but don't have to go through Congress, because remember, Congress is the one that approves treaties. Agreements are not binding because they're not treaties, but they're powerful tools so the president can negotiate foreign relationships. So what about the chief executive? Now, the chief executive is... the power actually does not come from the Constitution. It actually comes from the oath of office that every president is required to take before he enters office. And it says, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This states what his job is, and with this comes a great deal of those implied powers of, well, what does it mean when it says preserve, or what does it mean when it says protect, and what does he need, what powers does he need to defend the Constitution? So the president does not make laws, but it's his job to make sure that the laws are upheld and carried out, that they are executed. So it's kind of like if your parents make a rule and say, no eating in your bedroom, but they never enforce it. So what good is it? What good are the laws of Congress if they're not enforced? It's the president's job to make sure that the laws are carried out. Gun control, Social Security, taxes, environmental protection, and on and on. He has to make sure that these laws are being executed. To help him execute all of these many laws, he has to appoint people, and he has to appoint good people. And that's why he's the chief administrator, right? He appoints all these different people. He has a cabinet, he has judges, he has all these different people that he has to oversee to make sure that the laws are executed. So U.S. Constitution Section 4 states, he shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all officers of the United States. So he has a huge task of overseeing all these people. One of the more important appointments that he makes is to the Supreme Court. And we're going to look at the Supreme Court in detail, but just want to take this moment to say that the president appoints people to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's the Senate's job to approve that appointment, so they have the final say. The Senate says, yes, we'll accept your nomination, but the president's the one that nominates them. So, for example, going left to right on our picture of the Supreme Court, you've got Sonia Sotomayor. She was appointed by Obama. You've got Judge Breyer. He's appointed by Clinton. Alito, who's appointed by Bush. Kennedy was appointed by Bush. Elena Kagan was appointed by Obama. Thomas was appointed by Bush. Scalia recently died. So now Bush has the opportunity to appoint another judge. Now we have a problem because the president is going to appoint, obviously, somebody who agrees with his policies, right? He's not going to appoint a very conservative judge. He's going to appoint a liberal. He's going to, a Democrat probably. But the Senate right now is, the majority of the Senate is Republican and conservative. So president might appoint a judge, somebody that he wants to get on the court, but the Senate may not approve it, so you're kind of at loggerheads. So that's what you have to remember. Even though the president can appoint somebody, does not mean that they will be approved. So Scalia just died, so there's a fight over who will take his place. Roberts was appointed by Bush, and Kennedy was appointed by Reagan. So his job as chief administrator, appointing these people to carry out the laws, is very important. He is sort of a legislator. Again, we talked about this earlier in that he sets the agenda, and one of the ways that he does that is through the State of the Union. And so the State of the Union is addressed in Section 3. He shall from time to time give the Congress information on the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may on extraordinary occasions convene both houses. Both houses have not been brought together except for states of the Union. In the State of the Union, everybody comes together, the Senate and the House come together, and they listen to what the president believes the health of the nation, where he sees it going, and what he thinks is important and what laws should be passed. And it's important that the president sets an agenda. So, for example, this president's agenda has been health care, environment, of course, national security, just because of the state of duress with terrorism. All of that gets addressed in the State of the Union every year. The president does have this kind of strange power. It's not one that's normally talked about. It's called the presidential pardon. In Section 2, he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in the case of impeachment. So basically, it doesn't really matter except for people who are on, like, death row, right? So if you're on death row, the president can pardon you. Generally, this is seen, like we talk about, this is a power that is funnily seen at Thanksgiving when he pardons the turkey. He gives the turkey a presidential power. But when Richard Nixon was tried for, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency, Gerald Ford pardoned him for all of these crimes against the United States and everything, saying that the nation needed to just move on and heal. So it's for high-profile offenses. One of the biggest responsibilities of the president is protecting the country. He's commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So U.S. Constitution says in Section 2, the president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia. So only Congress can declare war, but the president is head of the army. It is the president's role to protect the country. He can, in peace, deploy troops for protection. So this is where we get the very broad power of the president deploying troops without an official declaration of war. The last time the United States declared war was in World War II. Ever since then, we've had a history of undeclared wars. But undeclared wars is almost as old as the Constitution itself. President John Adams and President Jefferson both carried on wars without an official declaration from Congress. They did get congressional authorization, which is different. They have to get money for wars. So if Congress does not give them the funds, because remember, Congress controls the purse strings, so the president has to ask for money, and if they don't give him money, then that wherever he's deploying, wherever the president's sending troops, you can't send troops without the money to do it. So Section 1 lays out like the bare bones, like how do you get elected, what are the qualifications. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen for the same term be elected as follows. And then it goes into all of the things that you have to be. You have to be 35 years old, 14 years resident of the United States. You have 2 4-year terms, right? So you can only serve a total of 8 years. After 8 years, you're finished. It also talks about impeachment. So you can remove a president. The president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for the conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Only 2 presidents in the United States have been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. Andrew Johnson, because there was a conflict between between Congress and the president. It was right after Reconstruction, and Congress was trying to get a lot of civil rights legislation passed, all the Reconstruction amendments giving rights to African Americans, and Johnson continually vetoed them. And so they were at loggerheads, and they kind of invented something, and they worked to impeach him. However, impeachment is the trial, right? So you go to trial, and Congress is trying to remove the president. That's what impeachment is. Johnson was not convicted. He missed being impeached by one vote. Okay, so he was impeached, but not removed from office. Bill Clinton, same thing. His reasons were that he lied under oath about an affair with Monica Lewinsky and tried to cover some things up. So Congress impeached him or tried to remove him from office. But again, he was not convicted. He finished out his term. So all of these powers that are stated and all the powers that are implied as the office grows, but it's all laid out in four different sections. And when you look at your lesson, you should heavily concentrate on those four sections, reading the Constitution and making sure you understand those things that are laid out in the Constitution, that the Constitution explicitly or expressly states the president can have, and then the growth of the office as the presidency in the United States has gotten bigger as well.